The sirens hadn't started yet. Baghdad was still holding its breath. Staff Sergeant Daniel Rios crouched behind a burned-out taxi at the edge of Sadr City, his M16A4 pressed into the metal, the handguards burning hot from the sun, and the last magazine, 600, maybe 8, a rooftop 2 streets over. A silhouette behind a broken parapet walked his fire across a traffic circle, short, controlled bursts that turned panicked civilians into targets and Marines into statues. Rios brought the chevron of his 4x optic onto the blur. Heat, shimmer, diesel smoke, a mirage that made the man and the rifle melt into the brick. He led a little and pressed. Miss. The wall spit dust a yard wide. The gun on the roof kept raking the street like it was mowing a lawn. He fired again. Nothing. The range beat the glass. The man kept shooting. 3 months later, in a windowless conference room at Aberdeen Proving Ground, a civilian engineer named Erica Klein spread a cloth on the table and set down an array of scopes like a jeweler displaying contraband. The Marines and soldiers around her looked like they'd slept in their uniforms for a week. Most had. Their rifles wore the standard fixed 4x glass the services had rushed into theatre because it was rugged, simple, and already paid for. Klein picked up a black civilian 3 to 10 times variable, something you bought at a sporting goods counter in peacetime. "This wasn't designed for Fallujah," she said. "It was designed to read mirage at 1,000 yards and count the holes it makes." Captain Hill of the equipment board, Camp Perry competitor, combat tour behind him, numbers, man to his bones, looked through the tube and forgot the room for a second. The whiteboard on the far wall had a hairline crack in the enamel he'd never noticed. He could see it now, crisp as the edge of a razor. Under the fluorescent buzz, only one question sat between what they had and what they needed. How does a fragile civilian target scope, dismissed as too fussy for door-kicking, become the backbone of the most lethal precision fire program of a generation? The first weeks in Iraq had been a blur of green dot sights and iron backups, urban fights inside 50, 100 yards, but the war learned fast and changed faster. On the far edges of cities and on the bare faces of Afghan valleys, fights stretched. Machine gun crews nested behind cinder block and rock outcroppings. Spotters with Soviet glass watched American patrols from football field distances and then some. Our standard glass could find them sometimes. It could not always solve them. Rios had qualified expert on a known distance range where the wind flags told truths and the targets waited their turn. He could still feel the sling bite of those days. But Sadr City had no wind flags and the heat boil turned men into ghosts. Across Baghdad, Ramadi and Mosul, reports stacked up on Hill's desk. Competent shooters, outranged by men with patience and elevation. In Afghanistan, the story sharpened. A patrol cresting a ridgeline took accurate harassing fire from 700, 800, 900 meters. Our optics could make a shape. They could not make a decision. Procurement is a river that prefers old banks. Memos said what memos always say. Proven systems, existing mounts, existing training. "We don't switch horses midstream," a colonel wrote, and the stamp at the bottom turned reluctance into policy. But Camp Lejeune had numbers from a quiet sprint of testing, the new variable power scopes on accurized 5.56 carbines and 7.62 rifles, prone, bagged, and then field prone off packs. 3-inch groups at 600, consistent sub-minute in good hands, wind calls that felt like cheating because you could see the mirage lean. Master Sergeant Dwyer ran the trial like a man waiting for something to break. He had the range officer's permanent squint and the maintenance chief's distrust of parts with opinions. External turrets, zero-stop rings, throw levers. He tapped each with a calloused finger and shook his head. "More moving parts than a pawnshop clock," he muttered, and nobody argued. Then the weather did what Iraq always did. It ruined the plan. Dust came first, powder-fine talc that found seams you didn't know you owned. The elevation knob that felt like a click track on Monday felt like packed sand by Thursday. The diopter seized under a film of grit you couldn't even see. Then heat. Then a squall that turned the range into mud, and the inside of every scope cap into a fogged window. Back at the lab, Klein read each failure like a confession. She changed O-rings and greases, swapped stainless for treated steel, cut tiny channels for dust to go somewhere that wasn't into a thread. Night after night, she stripped tubes down to bare bones, then rebuilt them with hands that shook only when the coffee ran out. On a plywood bench in a tent in Anbar, a lance corporal stretched cut-up bike tubes over his optic like a condom and slid silica packets from beef jerky bags under his scope caps. Unauthorized, unofficial, effective. In Helmand, a sergeant used a length of schmarg to wrap his glass when he wasn't shooting, cinched tight with a strip of 100-mile-per-hour tape. The fix looked stupid until the next dust devil walked the range, and his click still meant something when the storm passed. Limited fielding began, not a revolution, an allowance. DMR glass went on rifles that could cash the checks, accurized 5.56 SPR builds, riding 3 to 9 times variables, and 7.62 semi-autos with 3.5 to 10 times and 4 to 16 times rings of truth. The orders that pushed them forward read like compromise, detailed maintenance protocols, desiccant in the transit cases, extra caps, extra cloth, replace as needed, expect nothing. In places where the air was an oven and the ground made dust of anything dropped on it, the gear proved exactly as capricious as the skeptics predicted. Knobs bound up under talc, eyepieces fogged when a shooter pushed into a shaded room, then back into blast furnace glare. Zero wandered on rifles with rails loosened by doors kicked 1,000 times, but in places where the air cut hard and clear and the horizon actually meant distance, Kunar, Nuristan, the bones of mountains older than war, something else happened. Specialist Aaron Pike, 10th Mountain, looked at a dark notch across a valley and saw the glint of glass where glass shouldn't be. He measured the draw with a reticle he trusted because he'd watched it track 100 times when the wind was honest. 850, 910 maybe. The wind snuck left to right. He spun elevation, held 2/3 of a mile into the push, and pressed. The rock spat grey dust from a hole that wasn't there before. The second man didn't stand up again. Word gets around. A machine gun team that used to live at 700 meters moved back to 1,000 and found that wasn't safe anymore either. Patrols that used to sprint through dead space now scanned it like hunting country and found signatures, a hat brim, a shoulder, the blink of an eye behind a loophole. The glass made those things not just visible, but solvable. The reports came back from the mountains and they didn't read like brochure copy. They read like math. First-round hit rates with the new glass when atmospherics behaved, 70, 80, 90% in the hands of men who trained. Confirmed distances that rewrote what a carbine could do and what a 7.62 gas gun could do better. The same knobs that seized under Iraqi talc ran like clockwork in cold, dry air. The same magnification that felt like overkill in a hallway felt like oxygen on a ridgeline. Skeptics didn't disappear. They multiplied when the seasons turned or the mission changed. In the green belts along the Helmand, everything that broke in Anbar broke again. River dust had a weight to it that no lab had simulated. Sweat and sunblock turned rubber into smear and adhesives into jokes. Batteries died. Illumination washed out. Condensation grew inside tubes you swore were sealed. A corporal in a grape hut wiped his objective, watched it fog from the inside and said something that wasn't doctrine into his radio about leaving the thing in the case and running irons until the weather decided to be American again. Klein read those reports too. She tightened the tolerances that could be tightened. She changed coatings that could be changed. She made the seals bite deeper. She couldn't change the air in Helmand. The program didn't collapse because war never lets one story win. This wasn't about trophies. It was about odds. Give a shooter a scope that works 8 days out of 10, and he'll organize his life around those 8 and make the 2 survivable. Give him one that works 2 days out of 10, and you've given him a promise he can't plan around. In some battalions, the glass stayed in the case for weeks, and then came out on a day when the wind looked fair, and the patrol route crossed open desert. In others, the scope never left the rifle, and the rifle never left a dry bag unless someone needed a man to stop moving who thought distance was a shield. Rios healed into a different job. The battalion sent him back to Quantico to teach. He read after-action reports like they were letters from men he hadn't met yet. On a dry morning, he laid down with a 7.62 gas gun and a 3.5 to 10 times, set a steel plate at the far berm, and showed a kid from West Texas how to read the shimmer above the dirt and the twitch of a flag he'd tied to a broken target stick. "Don't hunt the target," he said. "Hunt the air." The scope makes the air loud in Kandahar. A young sergeant with a voice too quiet for a range tower learned to keep his glass alive with the same rituals that kept his rifle alive. Caps stayed closed until they didn't. Lenses wore sacrificial film. Knobs got brushed with a toothbrush he kept for gear, and never for teeth. He made a habit of writing down his zeros, every temperature and every load, like a diary of conditions. When a new private asked why he was obsessing over clicks, he handed over the binoculars, pointed to a culvert in the distance, and waited until the kid said, "Oh." Afghanistan made a certain kind of sense of the argument. The equipment wasn't perfect, the environment wasn't kind, but the combination of clear days, long shots, and men who learned the quirks of their glass gave commanders a capability they'd never had on paper in the old manuals. In Iraq, where heat and dust turned everything into a maintenance fight, the same gear felt like a bad bet until the time came when it didn't, and you were grateful it existed. In the end, the river bent anyway. Variable power optics stopped being boutique and started being baseline. Carbines wore low-power variables that could swing from hallway to hillside. Designated marksmen got better glass as a matter of course. Snipers rode 5 to 25 times like they were born with it, and thermal and laser ranges turned arguments into coordinates. The lesson wasn't that civilian glass saved the war. The lesson was uglier and more useful. Gear and ground are married. What fails in one climate is a revelation in another. What looks fragile on a PowerPoint becomes doctrine if it works on Tuesday, and if it works on Tuesday, often enough, no memo can kill it. In a storage cage stateside, an old fixed 4x sat in a bin with a faded tag and a serial number rubbed smooth. It had ridden a dozen deployments and told 1,000 lies and 1,000 truths, depending on the distance and the light. Next to it, wrapped in a rag that had once been a T-shirt, a variable power scope waited to be signed out again. Its turret still had a little grit under the rings like a scar. If you put it to your eye at the end of a long hallway, you could count the screws in the exit sign. The impossible idea had not become perfect. It had become understood by engineers who listened to failure like it was a teacher, and by Marines and soldiers who learned to treat glass like an instrument, not an amulet. It took ruined shots, broken knobs, fogged mornings and days when the air finally went still. It took a city where 600 yards felt like a mile, and a valley where a mile felt like a handshake. It took a war, and then it took another.